I gotta say, I found that panel really concerning in that I think e-commerce just means like companies that sell things on the internet. When I hear investors saying that companies that sell things are going out of fashion, get real nervous. But anyway, I'm Patrick. I'm Stripe CEO. This is getting close to the end of the day, so I'm going to try to be as quickly as possible. And I was trying to think about sort of what might be useful for the companies here and sort of what we ourselves have thought a little bit about. And the topic that occurred to me was global expansion and how it might be useful to think about it. In particular, I tried to distill sort of our lessons so far into about 9 points. I know there's a lot of Stripe users here, but for anyone who isn't familiar, Stripe is a payment platform for startups. We built it to enable sort of new business models and new technologies and sort of developers to explore new directions. The way we sort of think about it ourselves is we want to build something that increases the GDP of the internet. And obviously, sort of helping US companies sell more effectively to a global audience and also to enable companies based outside of the US is a really big part of that. Actually, just before I got up here, somebody showed me something called thepizzaapp.com, which is sort of like Uber for pizza. That's definitely a business model I can get behind. But the idea of Stripe is sort of we support everything from nascent apps like that through to companies processing billions of dollars a year. Stripe launched at the end of September in 2011. We launched in Canada. That is, we started enabling business in Canada at the end of September 2012. And then last year, we launched in another 10 markets or so in Western Europe and in Australia. So we now support thousands of companies based outside of the US, including folks like The Guardian and Virgin, and our fastest growing markets are certainly outside of the US. Of course, for Stripe, expanding internationally means sort of not just localizing the product or updating the strings or whatever, but also sort of working with banks and with regulators and all the rest in other countries. So it's been a fairly complex process. And the other thing that sort of informs my perspective is I grew up in Ireland, and so I'm really familiar with sort of the bitter anger you feel when you sort of encounter a US product and it's like US only. And so I figured that even if it didn't make complete strategic sense, Stripe had to expand as quickly as possible, or my younger self would really resent me. I was in Istanbul. Well, Stripe launched on Hacker News, and then like the day after we launched, sort of the top story on Hacker News was like an open letter to Stripe demanding that we expand outside the US. And like since then, people are always like tweeting at us and stuff, asking when Stripe will be available in their country. And I was actually in Istanbul this winter. And sort of the question I always got when I was meeting local entrepreneurs was, of course, when Stripe would be available in Turkey, and people were, again, tweeting at me and everything. But I guess I learned today that the Turkish Prime Minister has solved that problem, and we have no more Turkish users tweeting at it. Anyway, so right, the 9 points. So I guess the first is that I think the concept and the phrase international expansion is sort of an inherently like misconceived idea and betrays a US-centric worldview. Not that I feel strongly about it or anything, but as a community, I think that we still pay nowhere near enough attention to sort of the technologies and to the companies that are succeeding outside of the US. And so we're now all familiar with WhatsApp, and though the idea of Facebook paying $20 billion for it would have seemed ludicrous 6 months ago, it now seems like a good idea. But we still don't hear all that much about WeChat, which is, or Weixin, I guess in Chinese, which has 350 million active users and therefore is almost as large as WhatsApp. Similarly, Alibaba, the Chinese e-commerce site, will IPO very soon at a market cap that will likely put it ahead of Facebook and Yahoo combined. Tencent in China is worth about 2/3 of Amazon. M-Pesa in Kenya transact about 1/3 of Kenya's GDP every year. There's more penetration among Kenyan adults than Facebook does among US adults. In some ways, Zad in Somaliland has the world's most advanced retail mobile payments infrastructure. And so just in general, I think that it's really important that sort of as you think about global expansion, making your product available elsewhere, you sort of think about this bias in your perspective and really try to seek out things and news sources and so forth that correct it. If you're looking for something to read, I strongly endorse The Internet of Elsewhere, which is a book about these sort of technology communities of South Korea, Iran, Senegal, and Estonia, sort of places that you don't generally read about on TechCrunch or Recode or whatever. And actually, I think 500 Startups has done a really good job of sort of noticing this and using that as a big opportunity. So the US is sort of it's a largish country that's technologically very advanced in some areas, backwards in others. But I think sort of the really important point is that if you're going to scale as a technology company, you're ultimately competing in a global marketplace. There will soon be about 3 billion internet users. Fewer of 10% of those are in the US. And so international expansion really means figuring out how to address 90% of the internet's users. It means sort of correcting the bugs in your product that prevent you from addressing your true market. So that's point one. Two, you're like, okay, given all those stats and those companies and so forth, you're like, shit, how do I think about international expansion and how should I prioritize it? I think how you should sort of, the importance that you should give to international expansion is very dependent on the stage of your company and also very dependent on the category of your company. If you do not yet have product market fit, I think that you should not think about international expansion at all. I think international expansion is sort of it's a multiplier. It's like shifting into sort of a higher gear on a bicycle. And sort of if you've already got a good velocity and you want to sort of speed up a little bit, that's a good idea. But if you shift to that higher gear before you get started, it's just going to make it even harder. Like international expansion adds complexity, it adds overhead. Don't do it unless you're really confident that you fundamentally have the right product. But say you're humming along at speed and you do want to shift into that gear, I think then the question of how you should think about international expansion depends on sort of which of 4 different kinds of companies you are. So if you can sort of imagine a 2x2 matrix where sort of one axis is for the categorical variable of whether or not your company requires adaptation to the local market, right? So some products are just sort of inherently global, right? Twitter doesn't need a whole lot of adoption, maybe it needs a little bit of translation, but it's inherently the same product everywhere, whereas Uber and Airbnb sort of need adaptation to each individual market. They need a presence on the ground. So that's one axis, whether or not your product needs to be customized. And then the other axis is whether or not your product has strong network effects, right? In that Amazon, for example, needs adaptation to each local market, but its network effects aren't really all that strong. And so if you do not need much local adaptation and you do have strong network effects, then I think you're probably going to win, and international expansion does not need to be a really strong focus of your company. I think Facebook is a good example here. Twitter, same. Again, don't need much local adaptation. And even though Facebook saw a bunch of local competitors sort of spring up at various points in time along the way, eventually sort of the network effects just become too strong to surmount, and Facebook ultimately, I mean, again, it can take like 5 years or more, but eventually it prevails. And sort of you have to think about the opportunity cost, where if Facebook had been more focused on sort of killing the competitors along the way, well, sort of that detracts from just making the core viral loop stronger, and I think that's a mistake. If you have network effects and you need local adaptation, so this is, I guess, Airbnb, for example, very strong network effects, but absolutely requires a lot of local adaptation. I think it's the companies in this category that really need to sort of have this maniacal focus on international expansion. And if you look at them, I mean, I remember Brian Chesky saying to me that he basically spent 2012 on international expansion. Chris Sacca tweeted this chart of Uber's international expansion back, I think, last week, just showing the kind of the crazy focus that they placed on it in 2013. I think for these companies, it's incredibly important because, because you need local adaptation, that means that you're not automatically available in these markets. And if there are network effects, if you're not available, it's possible for some competitor to spring up to sort of really gain a stronghold, and it can be very difficult to unseat later on. If you don't have network effects, but you do need local adaptation, I think you should pursue some international expansion, but again, it doesn't need to be a really sort of big focus for the company. You don't need to pursue sort of an Airbnb, it is the top priority approach in the early days. So again, I think a good example here is Amazon. They kind of took their time in doing it, and because they were sort of just building sort of such an incredible platform, such technological advantages and kind of economies of scale and so forth, they did not need to take the Uber approach. And then I guess the last one is you don't have network effects, you do need local adaptation. I think that's, again, largely the same thing. So for e-commerce companies, I think generally you do need local adaptation. Generally, there are not very strong network effects. And so my advice would be to sort of to actually not have it be the top focus of your company, but to engage in some international expansion fairly early on as a signal to the market and to your customers that it is something you're going to take seriously. You want to make it less compelling and attractive to people who might start a clone by indicating that you are, in fact, going to it's a statement of intent, essentially. This, for what it's worth, is why we, as Stripe, don't worry too much about the Stripe clones that are springing up all around the world, in that there just isn't going to be sort of a Stripe for Spain any more than there's like a MySQL or a Linux for Spain, right? It just it doesn't make sense. There aren't these super strong network effects. These clones would have to have sort of the protective effect of a network effect for them to survive. So that's 2. 3. If you do need to adapt locally, I strongly recommend being in 2 markets from as early a stage as possible. As anybody who sort of builds software knows, going from 1 to 2 is much harder than going from 2 to n. And just want to make sure that your platform, your stack, sort of all the things you're thinking about, that you have enough generality that you can support international expansion. We launched in Canada pretty early on for this reason. We just wanted to make sure that we were sort of thinking about the necessary constraints. Again, I think that this makes a lot of sense for e-commerce companies. 4, if you do need to adapt locally, if you're not automatically available everywhere in the world, I don't know why every company doesn't do this, but I really think you should just, now, today, put up a page in your site that allows people to sign up for to be notified when you're going to be available in all the various markets. This does 2 things. It, 1, gives you tremendous data to sort of prioritize and know kind of in which markets people most want your product. And secondly, it makes the launch way better in the country, in that we launched, for example, in the UK back in August of last year. We had almost 2 years of sign-up sort of ready to be notified. And it meant the launch went sort of really tremendously. We're actually growing faster in the UK in absolute dollar terms than we did in the US when we launched here. So it really helps a lot. Number 5, as you think about international expansion and sort of opening up offices and maybe hiring developers outside the US or whatever it is, it'll be very tempting to think about outsourcing kind of product or engineering functions to other countries. And it's a kind of seductive idea because you think, well, we'll better be able to sort of customize to the local market or be sensitive to the local constraints. I strongly recommend not doing that and keeping sort of all your product and engineering organization sort of working whatever way it used to be. Don't conflate your market expansion with changing how your engineering and product organizations work. It's just too much to take on. 6, I do strongly recommend hiring country leads in every country to which you expand. And for those country leads, I strongly recommend having them be former entrepreneurs, in that being sort of when a product launches in a new market, it's an experience. It's an experience sort of like starting a new company, right? In that, okay, most of the product is defined, but you have a lot of sort of similar needs, like drumming up buzz or running events or convincing customers, and you start out without much reputation, brand, not much structure is already defined. Again, sort of the requirements are fairly similar. In, I think, every country where Stripe is a country lead, that country lead is in fact a former entrepreneur, and it's worked out really well for us. They're perfectly suited to the requirements. 7 is unless you really need to sort of expand rapidly at all costs, unless you're an Airbnb and an Uber, I think a common mistake is that people kind of take shortcuts as they expand, and that they sort of allow themselves to, maybe they partner with a local company or they compromise on the product a little bit or something like this in order to get into the market. I also think that that's a mistake. Sort of people outside the US really hate being sort of treated as second-class citizens or being subjected to the partnership version of your product rather than the real thing. They can sort of really see this. They want the real version of the product. And so, for example, we could have launched Stripe in Europe sooner by, I don't know, cutting some deal or something like that, but it wouldn't have actually been Stripe. It wouldn't have had the instant setup. It wouldn't have had the complete control or whatever it is. And again, unless you're really worried there's a competitor going to build tremendous defensibility in the short term, I think it's worth taking your time and getting the product right. 8, this sounds like a sort of truism to the point of being kind of tautological, but I think it's really important to pick the right partners. You should budget a couple months to go and just sort of get a sense for the landscape and sort of who the companies that are going to be around for the long haul or who wield the influence or whatever the considerations are. In terms of picking a partner, I think you should pick a company that is good enough to get the core parts of the product experience right from day one, but doesn't necessarily need to be the right product for the next 5 years or 10 years. Just make sure they're good enough to get all the core core parts right in the beginning. And then 9, I think this is just, I see this come up again and again, something to kind of factor into your strategic thinking as to how important international expansion is. I think people often miss the fact that your product might be a much bigger deal in other countries than it is in the US, and that you're not going to be measured to the same baseline in all these different countries. And so again, one thing that's been really startling to us is how we launched Stripe in the US, and we thought it was pretty great. It was maybe the best payment platform or whatever, right? But sort of other options existed, and maybe the baseline was here and Stripe was here, right? As we go to other countries, the incumbent existing payment systems are way worse. And so Stripe is actually a much bigger deal there, to the point where, as I mentioned, in the UK, we're growing faster, again, in absolute terms, even if you adjust for the relative differences in the population. So for whatever you're doing, there might be sort of something else in the US that does something a little bit similar, and you're 50% better, but in other markets, you can be 10x better, and that can really sort of propel your growth. So anyway, as we're, let me think, 18 months into international expansion, that's what we've learned so far. But again, it's getting close to the end of the day, so I don't want to ramble for too much longer. However, I think I probably have about 5 minutes to answer questions if anybody's interested. Thanks.
I'll try and run over there really quick. Hey.
Patrick, you talked about how outsourcing development is a bad idea. I'm wondering about how you create customer empathy when you've got your dev team, is it in Ireland or somewhere, and you're talking about going into, even going to Australia recently. How do you get knowledge of the local market?
Yeah, so I think having knowledge of the local market is really important. You should, as quickly as you can, sort of get people on the ground talking to customers and so forth, and kind of the feedback loop from those people to the people who are building the product. That needs to be very good, and you should do everything you can to make it as tight as possible. And I think the mistake is that thinking that having developers in all these different places makes that feedback loop better. Whereas as far as I can tell, it actually just makes it slower, right? In that it's pretty unlikely that changing the development practices that have worked kind of to date at the same time as undertaking international expansion is the most efficient thing to do, right? And so maybe kind of separate to the international expansion, you decide that, okay, we're going to start having this globally distributed engineering team. If that's the optimal thing, by all means, you should go for it. And in fact, Stripe has been sort of distributing the team a little bit over the past year or so, but I think that they're just two separate considerations, and I think people conflate them a little bit.
Hey, Patrick. So after Canada, how have you prioritized the countries that you've been in? Yeah.
Well, when we launched first in the US, basically all of the requests were for Stripe in Canada. And so we figured, well, if we just expanded to Canada, then we'd have solved the problem. And then suddenly all of the requests were for Stripe in the UK and so forth. And so some amount of it was just really kind of a fairly basic and facile interpretation of what the requests we were getting were. And we actually had this global page that I mentioned where you could sign up to be notified from a very early stage. And so we had kind of absolute numbers there. And so it was really kind of a combination of that qualitative feel along with just kind of some kind of macro top-down approach, and that like what are the largest markets or GDP or whatever, right? Although for Stripe in particular, we're a bit different because like this is developers selling to the internet as a whole, right? And so the domestic market size doesn't actually matter a great deal, right? In that, yeah, I mean India, for example, if you look at the e-commerce numbers in India, the market is actually still kind of weirdly small, but I think it's a mistake to consequently infer that sort of Stripe or India isn't an interesting market for Stripe, right? I mean, there's millions and millions of developers in India who want to sell to the same global audience that US startups do. So we actually go more by just kind of absolute numbers of people who want it rather than the macro contours of the market.
Great. I think we're going to have to wrap up and go on to the next panel, but thanks for a really amazing talk, Patrick.
Oh, thanks for having me.